So I have a long, complicated title, the Emerging and Digital Literacy Designer. But all that really means is that I both teach in our digital humanities lab through the English department, and I work on high impact projects. So these are things like fellowships where I'm working with students who self-identify as not having strong digital literacy skills. And I work with faculty and staff who want to integrate technology more thoughtfully into their teaching, research, or scholarship. So I'm here both to share with you from my teaching experience, and I have been teaching in the humanities at the college level for over a decade and have experience teaching adult literacy at an adult literacy center. But I'm also here to share my expertise with you and how technology can be used, not to be replace traditional teaching tools, but to enhance the lessons that you already have and the goals and objectives you already know to be the center of your teaching. I always say learning objectives first, technology second, right? The technology is there to make the teaching more immersive, more interactive, and more exciting for your students. So you see that I put my Twitter handle on this slide and in the chat. If you're someone who is active on social media, you can certainly reach out to me at any time. Okay, there we go. So these discussion questions were shared with you in advance on your Google Classroom, but I also wanted to post them here to start the discussion. These are questions that you can answer in the chat, or at the end of my talk, we can take some time to answer them out loud. I like to give you these questions first, so you can be thinking about them during the talk, so you can start kind of getting your ideas about what you might want to say before we get to the Q&A session at the end. These questions are really asking about your experience, and this is essential with an emerging technology because not everyone has exposure to any kind of technology, right? We know this from Pew Research polls that show great disparities, a digital divide in access. When we're talking about XR, or extended reality, what that covers is virtual reality. So those are headsets. You'll see headsets, they're kind of a trope now in pictures everywhere across education. But there's also been a lot of big books, movies, television shows about virtual reality over the past 5 years. Ready Player One, Upload, a lot of episodes of Black Mirror showing the more dystopian side of virtual reality. And in terms of augmented reality, where you use your phone or device to project objects into your real space, you'll see major initiatives like Pokemon Go and AR integrated into almost all furniture sales apps, right? If you use IKEA, Amazon, Target, any of the major furniture retailers, you'll see in AR, and you can press the button and see your couch in your room or see the lamp on your table using augmented reality. XR also includes mixed reality, which is when you can switch between the VR and AR, which is a very, very new set of tools that really HP is leading the way, and things like you might have heard of the HoloLens from Microsoft. And that's where a headset will actually let you see both your real world and the virtual world at the same time. And it also covers immersive gaming more broadly. So you might have heard of some of these ARGs or APGs, which is really popular right now in higher ed for things like freshman orientation, right? So first year students who weren't able to go onto campuses because of the pandemic would do these augmented reality games that helps them tour their campus virtually or interact with things on campus virtually. Very exciting stuff. So my questions for you here just have to do with, have you ever experienced AR or VR? Have you used a Google Cardboard or an Oculus Quest or played Pokemon Go on your phone? Have you ever seen XR used in teaching? Have you ever seen examples of this before? And have you ever used another form of emerging technology? Because all of the principles I'm going to give you here can also apply to console video games, PC video games, that's computer-based gaming, 3D modeling or printing, which is really exciting right now. And most local libraries actually have 3D printing stations now, or other examples of emerging technologies. I'm wondering if you can think of ways that emerging technology might be effective in your particular situation and scenario, and what might be intimidating for you or your colleagues about using these kinds of emerging technologies. What barriers do you see in your district with your students and your particular set, right, of situational barriers, which are going to differ for every single person here today. So those are my questions for you to think about. Again, I welcome you to pop answers in the chat if you're dying to answer, you're dying to respond right now, and then we'll get to a group discussion at the end about these. So how did I come to thinking about extended reality? How did I enter this realm of emerging technology? For me, it was in the early 2000s. There was a slew of articles about empathy and the lack of empathy in certain groups. So you would see popular media articles, news articles, radio programs about millennials lack empathy, doctors lack empathy, Silicon Valley lacks empathy, right? They were just calling out all sorts of groups, saying that they are unable to form meaningful human connections in their industry, in their lives, in their communities. And all of these mentions of empathy popping up across my feed got me thinking about, is there a lack of empathy? How do we define empathy? And is it important to have empathy? And if it is important to cultivate empathy, can it be taught? Because that's our job. We're teachers, and that's what we think about. What is essential for our students to be, thriving citizens in the world? So good news, especially for us humanities teachers, the research shows that humanity can be taught, or sorry, empathy can be taught, and it can be taught through the humanities, particularly through immersive narratives, like reading books and watching films and engaging in narrative stories about other people. This was exciting to me because I thought, we're already doing this. We're already experts, right, in helping students connect to the stories that are told through these more traditional forms of narratives. But what was troubling to me is that we're also extremely desensitized to these traditional forms of media. We have come to a place where multitasking is not only normal, it's almost unavoidable. It's almost difficult not to multitask. So while we're watching a film, we're also checking our phone and folding the laundry and watching the kids. While we're reading a book, we might also be thinking about what we need to make for dinner or what we're teaching tomorrow. And students are the same, if not even more so, because they've been multitasking their entire lives. And what I found difficult about that is, how do you get students to deeply immerse in a narrative to the point where they're going to empathize and connect deeply with characters if they're distracted, right? So this is what I was thinking about. I was thinking about the different disciplinary definitions of empathy, about how to teach it, about if it's important to teach it, and how to solve these problems of distraction and multitasking. So I read all the literature. I dove deeply into the debate. And I think that any subject where there is a really strong debate, where there's two very polarized sides that do not disagree, that's where the really rich, interesting research is, right? And that's exactly the case with empathy. You have best-selling books like Paul Bloom's Against Empathy that really argues that empathy is limited and it's based in emotions, and emotions are fleeting, and it's not going to lead to any significant change. Now, I have some issues around that, especially because I'm a feminist and I deeply believe in our emotional social learning and capabilities and how that impacts our actions. But it's a very compelling book, and there's lots of interesting information in there. There's also Lisa Blankenship's work, which I think is truly beautiful and speaks deeply to me as a researcher, which talks about how what's really at stake with empathy is not connecting to people who are like us, right? Who we see commonalities and similarities with, but people who we designate as other or being different than ourselves, who we have difficulty connecting with because we have trouble finding patterns or recognition in our behavior, histories, culture, economic, geographic, religious status, right? And that we can use the classroom, and particularly writing-based classrooms, as a place to think through those difficulties and help cross those bridges and divide across cultural and other differences, maybe even gendered differences, sexuality differences, right? You'll see that the last image there is going to get me into what I'm talking about here with emerging technologies. And that was this big debate that happened in like 2010 through 2012 about the empathy machine. And this was really a debate that was brought to light by Christopher Milk, who is a documentary filmmaker who entered the virtual reality space by making short films that depict very serious social justice issues in order to enact change. And Christopher Milk was working specifically in virtual reality to solve this distraction or multitasking problem, because when you do virtual reality, you put on a headset and you actually can't look away from the narrative. You can't scroll past, you can't do something else. It's attached to your head, and you can't really be in any other space or in any other place, and you're very much forced to grapple with the content that you're being immersed in. And in this TED Talk that Christopher Milk gives, he's really talking about Clouds Over Cedra, which is a piece he made with Gabo Aurora about people living in refugee camps. And this, you follow the narrative of a Syrian girl who is really barred access to things like education, proper living conditions, etc. And Gabo Aurora and Christopher Milk made this to actually display to the United Nations in hopes of changing legislation. Now, there was a lot of controversy, like I said, about this piece. You'll see Janet Murray's article there. Elizabeth Losh and Lisa Nakamura also wrote about this as being kind of a tragedy tourism, right? Where we're being forced to treat people as a subject of entertainment when they're in very difficult, tragic situations, right? And I think this debate is really interesting, and it shows how any new media object is going to take time to develop responsibly and critically. So let's talk about a good definition of empathy. Lisa Blankenship really points to empathy as being a conscious, deliberate attempt to understand the other. So this is not passive, right? You're taking the time to really think through this and actively work on this, right? And it's often, right, culturally influenced. So you can't separate your feelings of empathy from your own personal biases and positions in the world. What I like about this quote that I've pulled for you here is that it talks about the difference between empathy and pity or sympathy, which are often interchanged in our rhetoric, but are not the same thing, because Blankenship connects empathy with altruism. Again, it's that action. So you can't just feel bad for someone, you have to do something about it, right? You have to want to change the situation that is causing that pain or that discomfort. And because of that, this definition of empathy is really rooted in social justice. Not only did I read the critical literature, but I started diving in to literary texts that deal with both empathy and virtual reality. There's a great line in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is a novel from the 70s, a very popular sci-fi novel because Blade Runner is based on this novel. Of course, Blade Runner was just redone and kind of has a renaissance of popularity right now. But in this novel, the entire thesis, right? The hypothesis of this narrative is that what separates humans and machines is the ability to feel empathy. But like any great science fiction novel, it questions if that's real or not. Maybe the machines are actually more empathetic than the humans, right? In this futuristic world. And that idea of, is empathy inherent? Is it essential to our humanity? Is a really interesting one. And my students really like this book. They really like thinking about artificial intelligence and machine learning and how emotions, right, can be maybe cultivated or mimicked or, artificial or real, and what are the differences there. And then the other two books you see here, Ready Player One, I strongly recommend reading the book and not just watching the movie, and the play, The Nether, are books that I have my students explore these questions of virtual reality, virtual spaces, identity, representation, and the future of virtual spaces in our world. This is the TED Talk I talked about with Christopher Milk. I've linked it here for you to watch. I think you see it has millions of views thinking through whether virtual reality can actually be an empathy machine. And I think we can ask the same question really about all technologies, but I'm here to think through these new emerging ones with you. So what did I do? I wanted to expose my students to virtual reality. I wanted to see if they thought that they had an empathetic response to the content produced by virtual reality creators, but I wasn't exactly sure where to start. So in November of 2016, the New York Times actually sent every person who subscribed to the Sunday Times a Google Cardboard, the one you see here on the screen. That Google Cardboard actually came in the newspaper, and the print articles that you read in the newspaper were paired with the virtual content. I got to tell you, I love this. I love when traditional media, like a print newspaper article, is paired with new media. It helps us adapt to new media. It helps us learn to navigate new media when we have a traditional media content to root us, to ground us, to help us understand what we're viewing and why. And these examples from the New York Times were honestly breathtaking. They had art pieces, social justice pieces, political pieces. They had, everything from swimming with the dolphins to sitting in a jail cell. And it was so impactful for me that I called the New York Times and I said, listen, I think what you're doing is really innovative. I'd like to show my students this. Can you help me out? And they sent me 35 Google Cardboards to work with my students. And I've got to tell you that Google, the Google Cardboards online, the New York Times, the Guardian newspaper, a lot of people will actually send you a free set because they want their content viewed and they know that viewers are necessary. I've also done some excellent workshops with students where we make our own Google Cardboards. If you can imagine those long cardboard soda or like seltzer containers that go in your refrigerator, you can cut those off the ends. They make perfect Google Cardboards. You just need some lenses and magnets to make it happen. Students love to make their own. It's really fun. And you can purchase them online for $5 or less. I've put some links for you in the materials that I provided. So I had my students bring their phones. I had them bring their headphones. I chose strategically a couple of articles for them to read with the content to pair, and their reactions just astounded me. They had such deep emotional reactions. They had such enthusiasm. I mean, look at the face right here. Look at the expression on her face as she's viewing this content. It's awe and wonder and all the things that I was hoping for. So from this one course where I used this one set of application and got a very rudimentary sense of what it meant for my students to use this new technology, I developed a much larger grant project where I integrated virtual and augmented reality applications into 26 courses across every discipline at my university. I did everything from biology and chemistry to fine arts and creative writing. I hit every school in the college, and I asked the faculty, please provide me with your learning objectives and what your lesson plan is that needs an injection of maybe excitement and engagement, maybe something a lesson that you know is not working as well as it used to, and let me pair VR and AR experiences for you and come in and do a demonstration and see if it helps connect the students to the material. I hired 4 student researchers. We had a spreadsheet of all the courses and objectives and times. We paired 2 applications to every course that volunteered to be part of our study. And we did pre and post surveys for every student who interacted with the virtual content. This was incredibly exciting work. We brought the Google Cardboards and an HTC Vive to every class so that students were doing the mobile-based technology with their phone, but also even more immersive applications with a full headset and haptic feedback controllers. This is definitely a more expensive rig. The HTC Vive now is about $499 for a basic setup. But luckily, since I started this, the Oculus Quest and Oculus Quest 2 have come out, which run about $299 or even less with educators' discounts and packages, and that are highly accessible for a lot of students. The reason I chose the HTC Vive is entirely about accessibility. It allows you to adjust the distance between your eyes. So we know that this is a gendered and cultural difference about how far apart your eyes are set, and it helps you interact with the material better if you can customize that. And the haptic feedback controllers allow people who have sensory issues, vision and hearing impairment, to interact with material that otherwise they would be unable to. I can talk lots more about accessibility, but just explaining that there are differences in the equipment based on what brand and setup you have. What I found was that even students who are very unfamiliar with gaming technology were on equal footing because VR was so new and so few of them had interacted with headsets like this. They were able to lean into the feeling of newness and not knowing how to orient themselves or interact or move around in the space. And they were able to learn from each other. So I always partnered students together. So one was wearing a headset while one wasn't, so that they could help each other troubleshoot and narrate their experience as they went. I have lots of advice on how to set up these workshops, provide water, hand sanitizer, make sure people think about their hairstyles and footwear before they engage with this content. I have lots of material for you there on how you can set these up with your students, thinking through their needs specifically. But considering that we did thousands of students over the course of this 2-year study, overwhelmingly, we had students in the humanities and fine arts communicate incredible excitement and enthusiasm about the potential, not only for the content that already exists, but to think of themselves as makers and creators, as future leaders in this industry and in this space. Believe it or not, the sciences were actually more reticent to engage with this content. And that's the area where the industry is developing the most resources. The industry was really pushing STEM content. So I was interested in how can I support this more for humanities engagement. You saw my example, hopefully, before the course, this class began. I gave you the example of Lincoln in the Bardo because it is the first novel to ever be adapted to virtual reality. They actually had to write new law in order to do so. And it is excellent for both history courses and literary courses. Because it is based on a George Saunders novel, a very famous award-winning author, and because it deals with the content of Abraham Lincoln as a father during the war when he is losing his son, it really allows you to cover a lot of different content that might be relevant for you teaching humanities content at the high school level in Texas or elsewhere. One of the things I find most effective about this particular immersion is that, as you can see there, the text I gave you, and I also gave you a full packet with lots of examples of the text in the materials you were given. The text is actually nonlinear, and a little bit difficult to navigate. It is slices of archival documents, newspapers and letters that the author collected, interspersed with fictional text to make the narrative work. Because of that, it's difficult to keep track of who is speaking when and to whom and why. And the virtual reality application really brings that to life in a way that helps students understand the more non-traditional structure of the text. For those of you who did the VR experience already, you know that you actually have ghosts that surround you in a cemetery and deliver their stories in actually a more linear way, so it's easier to understand. And you have this pivotal climax at the end where you see Abraham Lincoln embrace his dead son in the crypt, and it's incredibly emotional and really allows you, the viewer, to connect to Abraham Lincoln, not as a political figure, but as a father and a human, again, with that piece, that empathy, right? That empathy piece that allows us to kind of change our perspective on a very well-known, well-trodden story of Abraham Lincoln during the war. So I'm love to hear more of your thoughts on this for those of you who've done it already. And you'll note that you can, if you do not have a Google Cardboard or any VR viewer at all, you can just watch this in 360 on any device, computer, phone, whatever, and just rotate the screen. But it is the immersion that I think enhances that emotional response. So if you can get access to that, I highly recommend it. There's, of course, lots of other examples, especially in terms of literature. One of my personal favorites is an augmented reality application of the Canterbury Tales. So this is really accessible. All you have to do is print out this page of the Canterbury Tales on regular 8 by 11 piece of paper with your regular color printer, right, at school. And you use your phone, any smartphone will do. And just like a QR code, the illuminated manuscripts, the illustrations on the edge become buttons that produce 3D models on your phone. So you can see here, depending on where you hover your phone over, you can see things like a representation, a 3D representation of the cathedral. You can see links to translations in the Middle English. You can see digitized images of the original manuscript. All sorts of fun things are hidden, right, as buttons within that manuscript. And all you need is a smartphone, an iPad, a tablet of some kind to hover over this image to do it. You can see I put a link to a further description there. And this was done by Tamara O'Callaghan and Andrea Palin, two English professors at two different universities who are just struggling to get students to connect to Canterbury Tales, which I think we can all understand, right? I can provide you dozens and dozens and dozens of case studies here. I edited an issue, a special issue of JITP about pedagogical applications of XR. So if you go to the link on the screen here, there are tons of wonderful articles from professors across the disciplines talking about how they've implemented extended reality and kind of the best practices and lessons learned from them. These range from just using the VR and from having students build, make, create extended reality objects together. I'm going to give you one really, really quick case study. I know I'm running out of time, but in my class that I teach, which is called the Cyborg Apocalypse, super fun literature course, which is a 200 level non-majors course. So I've got people from forensic science and chemistry and nursing and the humanities all in this course. What I did was I introduced Frankenstein, a book many of us probably teach or have thought about teaching. For the 200th anniversary of the publication in 2018, I wanted to do something big, something special, something that really celebrated the anniversary of this text. So I had students think about what they could be inspired to make after reading the novel. I also happen to know that there was a VR game that already existed based on Frankenstein called Frankenstein Beyond Time, and it's terrible. It's aesthetically beautiful. It's a great example of what's possible visually in the VR space, but the gameplay is awful and no one would want to play this game. So I had students play it to challenge them to do better, right? Because we were all kind of inspired by bad examples, right? If you read a bad recipe, you're like, I can fix this recipe and make it better, right? If you play a bad game, you're also inspired to like, I could do better. I could do a better job than that. So they read the novel, they played the bad game, and then I asked them to make their own virtual or augmented reality applications inspired by Frankenstein. This is probably my favorite example. Students worked in groups together. Sorry, I forgot. I skipped a slide here. I have all of these assignments for you. They're also on your Google Classroom, broken down by steps of how I scaffold them. So I start with asking students to pitch their idea. Very quick 5-minute elevator pitch. They write an abstract. They come up with some media to represent their project, and they shared their ideas with the class in an oral presentation. How are they going to remix Frankenstein into the virtual space? Students then voted on their top 4 projects that they thought were going to be the most viable, the most interesting, the most marketable, and then they worked in groups to bring those to reality. So what I asked students to do was to create a written proposal that had to have several key parts. I based these on grant proposals. So they had an abstract, they had an introduction, an environmental scan of what already existed, a literature review of research in the field, a technical specification section where they described how the technology would work, and a communications and outreach section. Who was their audience, how they were going to market at this. Very traditional research style paper. And then they also had to create a prototype using free to use storyboard software that allowed them to be more artistic and visual in displaying their ideas, and also allowed my creative writers to think through the script. And then they could create a short video using either my 360-degree cameras or animation software to show what it would look like. Think like a 1-minute commercial about their product. This example here, called Did She Do It?, was a wonderful project where students in this group focused on the trial of Justine, who was the maid in Frankenstein who's accused of killing the young boy William, but of course we all know that it wasn't the maid. And so it's a really interesting immersion into this debate over class and gender in the 19th century judicial system, Victor's role in that, and you play, in the simulation, you play a juror that actually has to decide the outcome of the trial. Wonderful example of how this new technology could lead to close reading, deep reading, and incredible understanding of a minor character and situation in the text. This is the storyboard they created for this. So you can see Justine in the trial, and you can see the narrative that they made. And I've linked the video there for you that they made to go along with this. Again, this is free, plug and play, simple to use software that they use to create this. Another example here was called New Species, and this was an open world game, incredibly popular with video game players. It's a stealth mode game where you have to play the monster and you're trying to navigate the woods. It's the environment comes directly from the actual content of the novel, and you have to make sure you're not seen, right, by any of the villagers, by the family that you meet, etc. Really beautiful idea of a game. And then my last example that I'm going to show you here, they just called Frankenstein VR. You don't have to have a clever title, right? But I wanted to show you the writing, the kind of writing that was produced along with the visuals here. And if you look at this last paragraph, I think you can see how effective this was in terms of producing good research and good writing. The last paragraph reads, Victor Frankenstein's creature is an embodiment of the inherent empathy gap that has been ever prevalent in the world. The creature is regarded as a societal other and thus rebuked from the 19th century world in which he resides. And while we regard the morals of the world 200 years ago as perhaps less evolved, the same prejudices exist under different guises in the 21st century. I mean, the students wrote that. That's not me, that's the students. And for me, I just want to, yell from the rooftops that that's exactly what I wanted them to get out of the project, and they're displaying it beautifully here in their writing. One of the interesting things that I've done in the past is I've actually partnered with tech companies to judge my students' final projects, and they've been able to provide monetary compensation and attribution for my students to work on these applications. They also provided internship opportunities, and one of my students was hired full-time after graduation for Mosaic Learning after this happened in my course. So reach out to your local tech companies, reach out to tech industry people in your community to help you execute some of these projects. I do have examples for you of my students' final projects. I've linked videos here that we're definitely not going to have time to play, but I wanted you to be able to explore further. So here's this obviously a trigger warning here, but my forensic science students turned to the last scene of Frankenstein where Elizabeth dies into a crime scene where you have to try to figure out the cause of death. Very interesting stuff. And this example is actually my students who are in psychology did a domestic violence video trying to educate people about signs of domestic violence and verbal abuse, which is also apparent in the novel that they wanted to explore more. Okay, so how do you assess this? You've got this amazing project with multiple parts. You've got a pitch, you've got writing, you've got a storyboard, you've got a prototype, you've got teams working together. You want to break it down into small chunks. I give individual grades on the pitch and individual grades based on which chunk of writing the student was assigned to focus on. I incorporate peer review at every stage. The students grade each other's oral presentations. They read each other's work. They revise each other's work. I also have a group final grade where students write reflection papers, share with me what their group members contributed or did not contribute that they were responsible for, and which allows me to give them a group grade, but also know how to reflect that in their individual grade. And I also have I use video feedback. So on those storyboards and on those digital elements, I create screencasts where I narrate my reactions to their product and share that live so they hear my voice and they hear me interacting with their materials. And I have an entire tutorial of how I do that linked there for you. Okay, so I'm going to pause now and take some questions.